So we are resuming Rabbi Eliyahu before launching into Rabbi Kook. So Rabbi Eliyahu really deserves his own treatment with a serious period of time, but he's not going to get it. We talked about the strength of the personality of Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, and how Rabbi Eliyahu follows him up without any apology as the Sephardic chief rabbi in 1983. He is a fiery figure, very much a take no prisoners type of a chief rabbi, both rabbi and as politician, and he takes the side of the rabbinate that we already saw with Rabbi Avram Shapira in June, which is he's very committed to his positions and to endorsing them and to promoting them, and everybody should be following them, and he stops only short of acts which would be overtly destructive. So, if you can remember Rabbi Shapira with his discussion about serving in the military during the disengagement and being in a position of having to enforce the eviction of Jews. So he said, no, the soldiers who are there should refuse to participate. These are illegal orders that you're being given to remove Jews from their homes. And he only stopped in terms of, he said he will not support a roadblock if that could cause emergency vehicles to be unable to get through, and he would not support any violence towards the government or towards those who were enforcing it. But everything short of that was what Rabbi Shapira said, and Rabbi Eliyahu was of the same mold. And we started talking about him last time in terms of his biography, and again, those who don't yet have the sheets think there are some more by the hot water. Thank you. He starts out in his youth as quite the fighter. We already said he was born in Jerusalem in 1929. In 1940, his father passes away, so he's just 11 years old. He is a fighter in 1948 and attempts to hold the Jewish quarter in Jerusalem. They're not successful. And then in 1950, he gets himself into a group called the Brit HaKanaim. Brit HaKavanim, as we said, covenant of the zealots, essentially, or as the Knesset website in source number 1 calls it, the Zealots Alliance. And as we saw in source number 1, I'm not going to read it aloud again, but I brought it here on the sheet for anyone who didn't remember from last time. This group, this Brit HaKanaim, the Zealots Alliance, members of the group are apprehended on their way to place a bomb at the Ministry of Education building in protest over the public school system. He himself is arrested, he is tried, he serves 10 months in jail. This becomes a big controversy at that time, and unfortunately it's something I think has been forgotten really in the history of the early state. Their goal is to try to make it a Jewish state in law. They want to get the state of Israel to follow Jewish law, and they will use whatever steps they believe necessary in order to get there. Menachem Begin is a part of the Knesset at that point, and he gets very upset about the way the case is handled. Take a look at source number 2. This is from the Knesset debate on the subject in May of 1951. The quotes that you're getting here are from an article about it, which, again, I assume it's their translation of Begin's remarks. His remarks were in Hebrew in the Knesset. I don't believe you when you say that illegal weapons were found, Begin said. And I do not believe you when you try to declare yourself a judge. A weapon was found somewhere, but no one knows to whom it belongs. The judge will decide whose weapon it was. You will not decide that. I do not believe you or your secret police. Do we have judges here in Israel or don't we? Begin argues. He says that the people who are, the politicians who are involved with this, are arresting Jews without cause. And he continues. Later in his speech, Begin said, you should not be shocked by the accusation that was mentioned here by M.K. Nurak that the prisoners were tortured. It is not my intention to establish this as a fact. I do not know whether there was indeed torture that took place. I do know, however, that the members of your secret police include people who collaborated with the British secret police, sadistic people who tortured the prisoners under their control. Right? And of course, Begin knows all about the treatment of the British secret police. He's not speaking about something that is abstract to him. Why then should you be shocked? Why should you pretend that it is unthinkable? Haven't there been trials in Israel concerning the use of torture? I am not making accusations. I am merely saying that I want facts. I want the court to rule on these matters. If you have evidence, then why did you use the emergency provisions of the law? And if you don't have evidence, then what allowed you to open a concentration camp in Israel? And keep in mind, this is Menachem Begin talking. This is not someone who doesn't know what he's talking about, and this is not someone who used Holocaust language lightly. He says, what you have done is a shameful act of terror, a deliberate act that brings more disgrace upon this state than all the crimes that Brit HaKanaim has committed or planned to commit. For today there is a concentration camp in the state of Israel. This becomes a very large issue, really worth discussing at greater length. But my point in bringing it right now is to illustrate the hostility between the sides and the allegations, the lack of trust, to say the least, between the sides. And that's the environment in which the young Mordechai Eliyahu functions. He recants not his ideas, but his methods. Take a look at source number 3 and a statement that he made. I admit the path I walked in the past is not appropriate for our generation. It is not that the Torah has changed, God forbid, but rather that the path to instill it in the nation has changed. He said, trying to force people to follow Jewish law is a mistake. And at that point, he abandons that type of activism. And as he grows up, he turns all of his efforts to scholarship. But the fire that drove that remains with him. I say grows up. I don't want to minimize, but hey, he was 21 in 1950. He's not a little kid. On the one hand, frankly, in their early 20s, in many ways they're still kids. On the other hand, you're responsible under the law. You can't get away with the idea that, I was a teenager and whatever. You're 21 years old, you should know better than to plant a bomb. Not that he did per se, but he's part of a group that in fact does that. He gets married in 1953. His wife's name is Tzivya, and he trains for the rabbinate. In 1960, he's ordained. He becomes a judge in Be'er Sheva. He is the youngest judge in the country at that point, which speaks to the scholarship that he brought to the table once he got himself harnessed to a desk. He was actually very close with the Baba Sali, which becomes very important. Anybody know who the Baba Sali was? Who was the Baba Sali? That's actually a very interesting explanation. The Moroccan Lubavitcher Rebbe. That's a very interesting way to put it, and not far off. Meaning, if you go into restaurants run by Sfardim, you'd find his picture on the wall, where in a Lubavitcher's restaurant, the Rebbe's picture would be. He was a very serious Kabbalist. Miracle worker by reputation. Google Baba Sali, you'll find it. Baba, B-A-B-A, Sali, S-A-L-I. You will find, that's how they spelled it in Morocco. You will find all sorts of stories about him and what he did. And Rabbi Eliyahu was close with him, and that matters because that becomes part of Rabbi Eliyahu's M.O. As we're going to see, he becomes known also as a miracle worker. In 1964, he becomes a judge on a Jerusalem court. In 1970, he becomes a judge on the Supreme Rabbinical Court of the State of Israel. And in 1983, he's elected, as we said, Sephardic Chief Rabbi. There are innumerable stories online about him. Maybe some of them are actually, correct. You never know. The stories a lot of them are about miracle working, but also about his involvement with individuals. He remained an activist, just without the violence. He took foreign tours, going to lecture to Jewish crowds around the world. He made public statements on international issues. He was very close with Jonathan Pollard. He visited Pollard 9 times in his maximum security prison in the U.S. He took a very hard-line approach when it came to dealing with the Arabs. And in terms of trusting the politicians who said, we need to give up land for peace, we need to enter into this agreement, take a look at what he had to say in source number 4, a piece of an article of his that's published in his work of Responsa, Ma'amar Mordechai. He says, the security situation, without getting into specifics, is such that the leaders of the country have personal interests, and they exalt themselves in the name of peace and abandon the issue of security. They are not a factor when it comes to saving lives. I'm not quite sure that's what he meant to say in the Hebrew, so I added in brackets. You could translate it as, they do not weigh as a factor the issue of saving lives. It wasn't quite clear to me what his intent in that sentence was, but he did not trust them. And look, we learned about the disengagement last year. And he was far from the only one saying that Ariel Sharon, with his decisions regarding the disengagement, was doing it for personal reasons, and the argument goes back to Rabin and back all the way to the late 70s and the Sinai. It's not new. This statement that he made here in number 4 was a statement made in 1994 regarding the Oslo process. So this is something that he was certainly consistent in down the line. When you look at him in terms of his rulings on issues of Jewish law, you can't really characterize him as either strict or lenient. He had rulings that went both ways. He was very modern in his approach to science. He wrote responsa dealing with issues of DNA testing, stem cell research, and so on, and was often on the permissive side. So, one of the things that people are apt to do, and I think it's a mistake, is to sort of correlate, or more than correlate, but see a real link between someone who's a firebrand and someone who is strict and harsh when it comes to the application of law, and it's not necessarily so. We'll see the other side of it with Rav Kook, with someone who is known for being gentle, but he was strict on certain issues within Jewish law. Rabbi Eliyahu, on the other hand, is known as a firebrand who gives no order, but he had his leniencies as well. He was extremely personable. He was extremely humble, interestingly. In 1974, the position of the top judge on the Supreme Rabbinical Court in Israel was empty, and Rav Avram Shapira joined the court. Rabbi Eliyahu should have become the Chief Justice by seniority. He had already been on the court for, I think, about a decade, and he should have been the one to be moved into that seat of being Chief Justice, and he deferred to Rabbi Shapira. He said he's the greater scholar. He should have the position of what's called in Hebrew, Av Beit Din, to be the head of the court. And he was very concerned about the welfare of everyone, all the individuals he met. If you take a look at source number 5, I couldn't resist one story. In general, I resist bringing these stories because I don't know what their source is in the end. Could they be true? Sure. But with the really many, many, many stories you find about him online, and these are recent vintage. These are stories from 20 years ago. Take a look at what you see in number 5. I think that there has to be some credibility just because you have so many people telling these stories about him. Once, a woman who had just gotten married, had just moved to Neve Yaakov, had some Taharat HaMishpacha questions and didn't know whom to ask. Taharat HaMishpacha in English is translated as family purity, questions related to use of the mikvah. And she was too embarrassed to ask her husband at the time. She was told by her neighbors, ask Rabbi Eliyahu. So she called him up. And Rabbi Eliyahu told her he needs to see the question, cannot make a ruling over the telephone. He told her, come to his Beit Midrash in the Bachurim neighborhood. Questions are often answered anonymously. That's standard in this field. But in the case at hand, he felt he needed an in-person conversation. She replied that it's too far to go there. Forget it, I'll just be stringent on myself. Rabbi Eliyahu replied that it's a sin to be stringent unnecessarily. So the woman starts to cry. She said she's too embarrassed to come so far. She's very confused about the matter. Rabbi Eliyahu told her he's waiting for her in the Beit Midrash for another half hour. She replied he doesn't need to do so. Flip the page. 1 o'clock that afternoon, her husband comes home from Kollel where he's been learning, unexpectedly saying, Rav Mordechai Eliyahu came to my kollel and told me, while you are sitting here learning, your wife is sitting at home troubled because she has unresolved questions. Go home and bring the questions, and I'll wait for you until you come. The woman told her husband she indeed had called Rav Eliyahu, but didn't say who she was. How did he know who she was and how to contact her husband? I'm assuming it wasn't as simple as caller ID. But the point is that he did not simply... One might have already looked at this and said, he went above and beyond by saying, I'm going to sit here and wait until you show up. But he did more than that. He, however it is that he knows who it is, and goes to find the husband and tell him, get moving, your wife needs you. That's the reputation that he had. As I said last week, he went toe-to-toe with Rabbi Ovadia Yosef. And again, we talked about Rav Ovadia and just no one goes toe-to-toe with him. But that's what he did. And as the Sephardic chief rabbi, so for example, he was, as I said, he was a Kabbalist personally. One of Rabbi Ovadia Yosef's landmark positions was to say that Jewish law should be determined without any recourse to Kabbalah. He said, all this mysticism has no place in the decision of Jewish law. Rabbi Eliyahu's main literary work that he left behind was this Ma'amar Mordechai collection of his responsa. And in the introduction to this multi-volume set, he writes a long and thorough defense of using Kabbalah in Jewish law directly against everything that Rabbi Ovadia had said on the topic. Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, we said, tried to bring all of the Sfaradim and Mizrachim from all their various lands under the banner of Rabbi Yosef Karo. He believed Rabbi Karo was the one they should all be following. But Rabbi Eliyahu said, no, my father's mentor was the Ben Ish Chai, Rabbi Yosef Chaim of Baghdad, and Iraqi Jews follow him. They also follow the Chida, Rabbi Chaim Yosef David Azulai, and so we're not going to follow the positions of Rabbi Ovadia Yosef. His immediate predecessor with all of his rulings, he's just saying, look, I understand that's what you think, but that's not what we do. Iraqi Jews don't follow him. He did not accept the agenda of Rabbi Yosef in terms of raising up these Sfaradim as a group, trying to unify their religious practices, and most important, he rejected Rabbi Ovadia Yosef's political compromises when they conflicted with his values. Rabbi Yosef felt that, first of all, Rabbi Yosef, we saw, supported exchange of land for peace in many cases, not in the disengagement, but in the withdrawal from the Sinai and in Oslo, and participated in the governments that did it. And Rabbi Eliyahu said, absolutely not. Then he said, members of Rabbi Yosef's political party, the Shas party, who go along with it, have to do tshuva. They have to repent for what they've done. So this is a little bit about Rabbi Eliyahu. There's clearly a lot more that could be said, but at this point I want to move on to talk about Rav Kook. We'll give him 45 minutes when he should have much more time. So let's shift gears and talk about Rav Kook. We've seen multiple models of chief rabbis. We saw Rabbi Unterman, who has the rabbi side of things as his main role, really stays away from political intervention for the most part, highly values unity, highly values the state. We saw Rav Ovadia Yosef. His position as rabbi dictates his political intervention within the state. That which he believes Jewish law requires leads him to get involved politically and try to make changes that will support his rabbinic agenda. And then Rav Shapira and Rav Eliyahu, who we just talked about, so I'm not going to go back over that right now. Well, Rav Kook is in a different ballgame, because Rav Kook is the chief rabbi before there is a state of Israel at all. So that changes the rules of what he can do. No one views him as representing the British government. That's not the way he's perceived. His role is established by the British mandate in 1921, 1922, by election. At that point, he is already the chief rabbi of Jerusalem. But that's not a British recognized position. When the British take over, they're the ones who convert this into a formal chief rabbinate position. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. He does have interactions with the British government in this role. There's a classic picture of him standing on the street, and Herbert Samuel, the British, he was the commissioner for the mandate, is walking on the street right in front of him. Clearly, they just had a meeting of some kind. But what he doesn't have is this sort of split identity, Rabbi Kook, of rabbi on the one hand, representative of government on the other. As far as he's concerned, his model is very clear. His role is to lead a unified Jewish people to the arrival of the Messiah. That's what Rav Kook believes he is doing as chief rabbi. I gave you one picture here, then I gave you a link where you can find many more pictures of him. I'm going to come back to that picture because there's a story behind this picture. It's one of the classic pictures of him, but you'll see what I mean. A little bit of biography, although I really want to get to talk about his policies. So he's born in Latvia in 1865. He's a brilliant, brilliant student. He goes to learn in the yeshiva in Volozhin. The yeshiva in Volozhin was the major yeshiva in Eastern Europe, really in Europe in general, in that era. Basically from the end of the 18th century when it was founded until it is closed in the very beginning of the 20th century. That's its own story in terms of the closure of the yeshiva. It was considered to be a yeshiva for the elite. It was not rank and file. It was the people who are going to go on to teach others. We've talked about this on other occasions. Those who were here remember we talked about the pin test to get into the yeshiva, right? Where they take a Talmud and they put a pin through it, and now you, the student, have to tell them what word on each page the pin went through. And believe it or not, I've seen this done. This is doable. but it takes a level of scholarship. And that's your entrance exam. This is not graduation. This is how you get in. So his father had studied in yeshiva in Volozhin. He goes to study there at the age of 19. The yeshiva is led by Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin at the time, also known as Nitziv. And we're going to come back and talk about him because he's a major influence on Rav Kook. He's only there for 2 years. We'll see why in a moment. But the Nitziv is quoted as saying that had the entire Volozhin yeshiva been established just to teach Rav Kook, that would have been a worthwhile endeavor. He is brilliant. He is inquisitive. He goes beyond the study of traditional subjects that are learned in yeshiva. He studies Tanakh, biblical text. He studies philosophy. He studies Hebrew language. He studies mysticism. He writes poetry. He begins to publish in 1886. He begins to publish already at a young age in the 1880s. In 1886, he's 21 years old. He marries Batsheva Rabinowitz Teomim, daughter of the Aderet, who was the chief rabbi of Jerusalem. He takes a rabbinic position at the age of 22, maybe 23. It's unclear. There are different records that I've seen. But that's when he leaves the yeshiva. He gets married and he goes to take a job as a rabbi in Lithuania. First in the city of Zoimel. I've seen it written Zimel. Zoimel, I imagine that has to do with where your Yiddish comes from. And then a community called Boysk. But while he's in his first community, his wife passes away, leaving him with a 1.5-year-old daughter. And he marries her first cousin, Reza Rivka, at the encouragement of his former father-in-law. He's an acknowledged rabbi and teacher while still in Lithuania, before he ever makes Aliyah. He weaves an exceptionally wide-ranging tapestry of sources, biblical, Talmudic, from the liturgy, from Kabbalah, from philosophy, and in particular he explores 3 central themes in his writing. The divine spark that animates every human being, the power of the revitalized... Now here's a word that you can't use anymore because he who shall not be named has now traced it up. I was going to say, and I had it in my notes, Jewish nationalism. Now I can't even use the word anymore. I can't without thinking of it. There has to be, really, no? Patriotism? No, that's gone too. I don't even know what to say anymore. But the power of the Jewish drive to once again have a state. He believes in the power of that, not only to form a community of Jews that will be autonomous, that will be self-governing, but he believes that will be better for individuals, Jews and non-Jews, better for the Jewish nation, and better for the world. And he believes in the redemptive potential of personal and national repentance. And in many ways it is. But a messianic brand of it, as we'll see. He combines these ideas to come to the conclusion that the efforts of the Jews who are trying to restore Jewish life in the land of Israel on a national level, not just individual Jews or families or communities, but to make it this unified thing, that the efforts of those who are religiously observant and those who are secular are to be honored and supported as an act of national repentance and return, which will usher in a messianic age that will benefit, as I said, everybody, Jew and non-Jew alike. He heavily promotes Aliyah. But his vision of Aliyah is not like what you see from others. And we talked about this, those who were at my class in Beth Tikva on Monday. We talked about religious Zionism, political Zionism, cultural Zionism, and so on. So take a look at source number 6. This is unique. This is from a book that he wrote called Orot, meaning lights, and the section where he describes the land of Israel. The land of Israel is not an external thing, an external prize acquired by the nation, a means toward the end of national unification and reinforcement of the nation's physical or even spiritual survival. He says, the land of Israel is not simply the place where I go to do my mitzvot. It's not simply the place where the Bible says I'm supposed to return one day. It's not even the place that's going to keep Jews safe physically, a la Herzl. The land of Israel is an independent entity bound to the nation in the bonds of life. As far as he is concerned, it's like the land of Israel is an individual. It has a soul. And that's the way that he relates to it. It's a very mystical idea, clearly. He believes that this is the place where a Jew can realize his spiritual potential. And this he is preceded by the Kuzari. Rabbi Yehuda HaLevi in the 11th century talked about this. Rabbi Yehuda HaLevi compared the land of Israel to what you see on wine bottles, except he didn't have the wine bottles. You know, in the wine bottles they talk about how a particular land is good, or let's say the hills or the climate or whatever is good for producing this particular kind of wine. So that's what Rabbi Yehuda HaLevi said. He said that grapes can only be grown in territory that is good for those particular grapes. And if you put them in the wrong soil, they're not going to do well. And he said the same thing is true for the Jews in the land of Israel. That was Rabbi Yehuda HaLevi's idea. He said the Jews will develop and grow spiritually in this land particularly. And Rav Kook adopted that idea. Take a look at source number 7. A Jew cannot be devoted and faithful to his thoughts and ideas and imaginings outside Israel as he can in Israel. Manifestations of sanctity on every level are purest in Israel. This is where the Jews belong. And he supports the Jews who have returned to what is then Palestine to create farming colonies, even as he lobbies for greater observance of Jewish law in the land. And he succeeds in some places and he's rejected in others. And here I brought you a piece from an article with a great title. It's from the Los Angeles Review of Books. After Rabbi Yehuda Mirsky came out with his biography of Rav Kook. So this is a review of the biography. Take a look at this. I like the title, Many Admirers, Few Disciples, The Life and Legacy of Rav Kook. I think that's very well said. There are few who have really followed in his mold, although many will claim to be carrying on his legacy. In the fall of 1913, so we're jumping ahead a little bit in time for this. In the fall of 1913, Avram Yitzchak Kook, then serving as chief rabbi of Jaffa, set out on a journey north. Accompanied by other rabbis, Rav Kook, as he was commonly known, traveled to the new Zionist settlements along the coastal plain and in the fertile Galilee region of Ottoman-ruled Palestine. The rabbi's goal was to teach and preach to the young socialists who had founded these small communities, part of a wave of Jewish immigration in the years leading up to the First World War that came to be known as the Second Aliyah. Between 1904 and 1914, some 20,000 Jews arrived in Palestine, mostly from the Russian Empire. These pioneers, as they were known, were fiery idealists, hoping to remake themselves, the land, and Jewish history through communal labor and cultural revolution. They were also vociferously anti-religious, having abandoned traditional commandment-bound observance for the Zionist promise of a new Hebrew life, a fact that Rav Kook knew well. On kibbutz settlements like Degania, Kinneret, and Ein Charod, kosher food was not to be found, and even and especially Yom Kippur went uncelebrated. In his own way, Rav Kook was no less radical than the young pioneers. Unlike other representatives of traditional Judaism in Palestine, he did not dismiss the anti-religious Zionists as heretics and sinners. Rav Kook's response to Zionism's revolutionary secular challenge to tradition, its claim to have wrested the mantle of Jewishness from Judaism, was to transform it into theology. Even as the pioneers sought to sacralize their secular undertaking, to make that holy, Rav Kook intended to reappropriate Jewish nationalism as a religious movement springing from the deepest wells of the faith. The pioneers might have seen themselves as socialists and enlightened rebels. In Rav Kook's admiring eyes, they were unwitting saints. Through their active commitment to building Jewish life in the Holy Land, they were unknowingly fulfilling a divinely ordained plan. Returning them to traditional piety would, the rabbi believed, strengthen their resolve and hasten the swiftly approaching Messianic age. As Yehuda Mirsky reveals in Rav Kook, Mystic in a Time of Revolution, this mission of religious revival did not succeed in the short term. A few communities, such as the small settlement of Poriyah, where the rabbi ecstatically danced all night around a campfire with the pioneers, received him warmly. Most others were far less welcoming, if not openly hostile. During his month away in 1913, Rav Kook convinced no one to return to Jewish religious practice. Try as they might, Mirsky writes, the rabbis, quote, could not talk the young revolutionaries into embracing precisely what they had come to Palestine to reject. So, what I want to make clear here are a few things. First of all, keep in mind the picture that you saw on the page there. That's the way he dressed all the time. meaning he's going out to the farms and all that. He's walking around there dancing on a campfire. That's what he looks like. Number one. Number two, he's trying to reach everyone, and he's not deterred by them being anti-religion. That doesn't bother him. He obviously has a mission. There's no question that he believes that they would be better off and the movement would be better off, as it says here, if they were to return to traditional Jewish practice. But he embraces them where they are. Number three, they don't necessarily embrace him back. And we're going to get to that, I hope, by the end today, because that's something that I want to come back to and discuss. Is one of the big controversies is how they feel about his reaching out to them. It's not so simple and straightforward. But to go back to the history of it, and I realize I'm monologuing and I apologize, but there's so much to cover and I feel like it's justified, and as always I am reachable by email and I may respond within a week. In 1904, Rav Kook accepted a position as chief rabbi of Jaffa, so that's when he actually leaves Eastern Europe for the first time. But Eastern Europe he leaves. Europe for the first time. Because he's in Switzerland when World War I breaks out. So in other words, he's been the chief rabbi of Jaffa. He's been doing what we just saw here in source number 8. And then he's in Switzerland, I think it was a fundraising trip, and he's stuck there when World War I breaks out. He's there for a year, and then the community of Machzikei Hadat in London invites him to become their rabbi, and he is their rabbi for the rest of World War I. So he's stuck in England. He returns to Israel after the war. He becomes chief rabbi of Jerusalem. There's a lot of turmoil when he accepts the position in Jerusalem for multiple reasons. One, it goes back to something we've talked about on other occasions, which is the Chalukah. The Chalukah is the system in which European Jews support the communities that are living in Israel, and there's a big battle over control of these funds that are coming in. So we had talked about how the Sephardim were the ones who originated this, and then the Ashkenazim took it over in the end of the 19th century. That did not go well in its own right, but you have Jews from different parts of Europe who are now living there. You have the Polish Jews, you have the Russian Jews, and who is Rav Kook going to be allied with? And if he's the chief rabbi of Jerusalem, who is going to benefit from these funds? There's a lot of fear that he's going to take it over. Also, he's reaching out to the secular Zionist community. There are a lot of rabbis in the establishment who think that is absolutely wrong, that the secular Zionists are heretical, that they're corrupting the land. For more on that, see my Monday morning class at Beth Tikva. We'll be discussing that there. But there's a lot of hostility. At the same time, the Chavetz Chaim, Rabbi Yisrael Meir Kagan, who is generally acknowledged as among the greatest, if not the greatest, leader of Jewish scholarship and community in the early part of the 20th century, addresses Rabbi Kook with the highest of honorifics and praises his intentions. The Chazon Ish, who was unquestionably the leader of Haredi Jewry in Israel in the middle of the 20th century, also praises Rav Kook and addresses him with terms of respect. You have, on the one hand, a lot of hostility, and on the other hand, a recognition that he was great as a scholar. And go back to the Nitziv's comment about him in Volozhin. Pure scholarship, which is the barometer by which somebody is measured in that world. How good are you as a scholar? And as a human being, as somebody who is trying to reach out, he gains the respect of others, but not of everybody. As chief rabbi, well, that brings us to the British, I suppose. In 1921, with the start of the British Mandate, they recognize a chief rabbinate. They declare Rabbi Yaakov Meir as the Sephardi chief rabbi, and Rav Kook as the Ashkenazi chief rabbi. I think it's a measure of Rav Kook's shadow and footprint that no one knows anything about Rabbi Yaakov Meir, as the Sephardi chief rabbi. Everybody knows about Rav Kook. People have heard about him. Rabbi Meir, not a whole lot about him. Rav Kook declared that the new chief rabbinate will lay the groundwork for a new Sanhedrin. Sanhedrin was the high court that met in the temple in Jerusalem. He also started a yeshiva called Torat Kohanim. What does Torat Kohanim mean? The Torah of the Kohanim, thank you. The teaching of the Kohanim. It is dedicated to teaching temple ritual, because he believes that what's going to come is a Jewish state, and what's going to come is a temple in Jerusalem, and there's a need to learn how to conduct the services. You may know, we talked about this a few years ago when we did a series on Jews and food, that Rav Kook himself was vegetarian. But he squared the circle. He could deal with this issue of vegetarian on the one hand, temple services, animal sacrifice on the other. How he did it is not within the scope of what we're going to talk about today. But take a look at source number 9, at the controversy that surrounds his establishment of this yeshiva. Oh, I neglected to mention, you know where Torah Kohanim was located? The Muslim quarter. Right next to the Temple Mount. I forgot to mention that. So take a look at source number 9. Article by Mati and Bari, Religious Zionism and the Temple Mount Dilemma, Key Trends. According to Rabbi Kook, the process of national revival of the Jewish people was perceived as a revealed end, Kates Megula, an openly visible sign that Messiah is coming, and was ultimately due to lead to the full redemption of Israel, namely the establishment of the religious kingdom and the renewal of the rights on the Temple Mount. He says kingdom here. That's a mistake, meaning it wasn't necessarily monarchy. Rav Kook supported elections and democratically so, although we have to talk more about who he believed should vote. So we'll get there. To this end, he established the Torah Kohanim Yeshiva in 1921. This institute of religious higher learning was planned, as its declared intention stated, to study, quote, the Talmudic order of Kodshim. Kodshim is the section of the Talmud that discusses temple sacrifice, the regulation of worship in the temple, the commandments that relate to the land of Israel, and the religious laws relating to the state. The yeshiva was founded on the expectation that the national revival movement led by Zionism, which was characterized by a disconnection from religion, would rapidly return to the fold of sanctity, the completion of ultimate redemption, and the building of the temple. As is clear from his pamphlets, it should be Siftei Kohen. Sfatei Kohen may be correct grammatically. Lips of a priest is the literal meaning of it. It's taken from a verse in the prophet Malachi, in which he described the goals of the new yeshiva. Kook believed the revival of the Hebrew nation, despite the fact that it was constituted primarily as a secular initiative by Jews who rejected religious authority, was nevertheless intended to secure a sublime spiritual purpose. It would ultimately emerge that the final purpose of this revival was to bring the religious redemption of the Jewish people, the zenith of which is the building of the temple, quote, the anticipation of seeing the priests at their worship and the Levites on their stand and Israel in their presence. This is the foundation that bears this entire revival. According to Rabbi Kook, this day was steadily emerging, and therefore preparations must be made. Torah Kohanim Yeshiva was thus intended to attend to the practical preparation of priests and Levites for their worship in the temple, based on the acute messianic expectation that the temple would indeed be built, quote, speedily and in our days. Rabbi Kook taught the tractate of Kodshim in the context of this hope that the sacrifices would be reinstated. This seems to have formed the background for the establishment of Torah Kohanim Yeshiva. A correspondent from the London newspaper, The Christian, interesting, visited the yeshiva, which was situated in the Muslim quarter of the old city of Jerusalem. He informed his readers that Rabbi Kook had established the yeshiva due to his sense of extreme urgency regarding the establishment of the temple. The Zionist executive in London demanded explanations following this report. Rabbi Kook replied that the requirement to study the temple worship was now more pressing than ever. Our faith is firm. Days are coming when all the nations shall recognize that this place which the Lord has chosen for all eternity as the site of our temple must return to its true owners, and the great and holy house must be built thereon. An official British committee some time ago asked for my opinion regarding the location of our temple according to our estimation. I told them that just as you see that we have the right to the entire land following the Balfour Declaration, even though the entire world was distant from this, so days shall come when all the nations shall recognize our rights to the site of the temple. Clock is ticking. But he's very clear about his beliefs. In 1924, he establishes a different yeshiva, Yeshivat Merkaz Harav. It becomes known later in memory of Rav Kook after he passes away, which becomes the center of religious Zionism, and it's synonymous with his teachings. As I mentioned briefly in the beginning, he has many official interactions with the British. There's a book, Malachim Kibnei Adam, literally translates to angels like men, angels in the form of human beings, which record his interactions with officials from the British Mandate. He traveled abroad in the service of the Jewish community in Israel. I mentioned already trips that he took to the U.S. But this picture that I gave you here, and you can't really tell here from the background because it's black and white and because you only see a piece of it. But if you look at the original, you'll see it doesn't look like a street in Israel. And in fact, it's not. This picture is taken in Washington, D.C., it is believed, in 1924, on a trip that he took through the U.S. fundraising for communities in Israel, and on which it seems he met President Calvin Coolidge. So it's an interesting little piece of trivia. He's not the president I would have chosen necessarily out of all of them. He's not the most successful. But, he was the president. Bottom line, he's the president at that point. Rav Kook passes away in 1935. He does not get to see the state. He also does not see the Holocaust. One wonders what he would have said about both. His influence continues to be felt to this very day. And here I want to talk about his ideas and ideals and where they went in the state. So first of all, I mentioned in the beginning the influence of the Nitziv, of Rabbi Berlin, his teacher. So we mentioned the eclectic character of Rabbi. Sorry.
I didn't get it. When he passed away?
1935.
35, but he was born in 1929, you said.
No. 1865. Yeah. No. Rabbi Eliyahu was born in 1929. Okay. So we mentioned his eclectic scholarship, that he liked to study different fields. That was something that the Nitziv was known for. Berlin wrote on manuscript issues and areas of Midrash that nobody in the serious yeshiva world touched at his time. But more than that, he's known for, the Nitziv, Rabbi Berlin, was known for his stress on social relationships, the way that people relate to each other. I brought you an excerpt in number 10, but the interest of time, I'm going to say it outside of the text. You can see it there. His introduction to the book of Genesis, he talks about the fact that this book, which is known in Hebrew usually as Breshit, has another name in Torah literature. The other name is Sefer HaYashar. What does Yashar mean? Straight, right? That's the instructions you get in Israel. Yashar, right? V'achkaf smola. Straight to the end, and then hang a left. But Yashar means straight in terms of human behavior. It means that you act with people in a just and fair and respectful way. And Rabbi Berlin said the reason why Breshit is called Sefer HaYashar, the reason why it's called the Book of the Straight, is because that was what our ancestors were known for. It's what made them special. And he talks about Abraham and his interactions with others. That's the piece I brought you here. But he says what it's trying to teach you is that's the foundation of who one should be, to be Yashar with everybody. And that's something you see with Rav Kook. If you flip the page to source number 11, another piece from Rabbi Berlin, which I really, really enjoy and I recommend reading, he values individuality. In this piece, he's commenting on Bilam's blessing of the Jews. Bilam is the non-Jewish prophet who tries to curse the Jews, and everything he says comes out as a blessing. So one of the things he says is he talks about the Jews as a garden, keganot alei nahar, like gardens by a river. And Rabbi Berlin says, when you design a garden, keep in mind he's living in Volozhin at the end of the 19th century. I don't know what they had in terms of gardens, but he knows gardening. He says when you design a garden, you have one central color, one central theme, and then you have all of the other flowers and plants around it that will offset it, that will match, that will bring out the color of it, the minor elements. And you have this one major one in the middle. And he says that's the way Judaism works. The Torah is filled with mitzvot. But everyone has to find the aspect of that really resonates with them. That's going to be the central theme of their Jewish identity, not to the exclusion of the rest of it. Berlin wants to be very clear. He's not saying you don't do the rest. But what he's saying is everything else is there, but it's not the major theme. There's something within Judaism that should resonate with everyone, and everyone has to find that which resonates for them as an individual. That's why Berlin's idea, which Rav Kook wholeheartedly adopts, as we're going to see very, very, very soon. Rav Kook is influenced by this. He's a very strong believer in Jewish unity. I brought you a one line of his in number 12, where he talks about splitting the Jews into segments, into different sub-communities. He calls it idolatry. He says, you can't split the Jewish people. We are one nation. And this is expressed in his legal philosophy as well. When he issues rulings of Jewish law, he takes into account the needs of the community, and he believes in the power of the community to establish law. There's a very interesting principle in the Talmud. The sages who write in the Mishnah, the authors of the Mishnah, are called Tanaim. The discussion about the Mishnah that makes up what's called the Gemara, those sages are called Amoraim. Tanaim extend back into the Second Temple period, so you're talking about before the Common Era and right up until the beginning of the 3rd century Common Era, when the Mishnah is actually set down in its full written form. Gemara extends for a few centuries after that till at least the middle of the 6th century. The sages of the latter period, these Amoraim, will not argue with the sages of the earlier period, the Tanaim. Whatever a Tana said, whatever one of the authors of the Mishnah said, is beyond dispute by one of the later sages. So it's discussion in the literature, why is that? Why can I not argue with those who came earlier? And most answers to this come down to, because the earlier ones were recognized as being greater. And we don't have the scholarship that they had. Rabbi Kook gives a different answer. Take a look at this excerpt I bring you from number 13, source number 13, from his Be'er Eliyahu, which is a work of law. He says, it appears correct to say that regarding the establishment of law, outside of the framework of decrees and enactments, the rule of a court cannot cancel the words of another court is not truly relevant. You may only follow the judge of your day. He says, when you're dealing with law in general, you go with whoever the arbiter is today and what their ruling is. However, regarding a tradition which has been accepted in Israel and has spread to rule like one of the disputants regarding a particular law, where there is a dispute and a practice has become accepted as this is what we do, the concept of an enactment is relevant. I realize I could have brought a better piece. This probably is not so clear. I apologize. But what he says here is that the decision of the Tana, of the earlier sage, becomes law by dint of popular acceptance. The fact that the community of those who are observing these laws have said, we accept this position, the fact that they've done that enshrines it in law such that those who come later are not able to say, wait, I want to disagree. Because the community has accepted it, that's what lends it its legitimacy as a position. I'm not getting into discussions now about the pass as a vote, not a veto, reform, whatever. Those are fun discussions, but beyond what we're dealing with right now.
This is talking about Jewish law.
Correct.
Not,
Jewish law.
General national law.
Correct. No, this is Jewish law. Although I will say, he accepts the authority of the government, including democratically elected government, on the same principle. It's been accepted by the community, and that's what gives it its authority, even though it's not a king. So your point actually is well taken. It extends to his views of democracy. At the same time, as he's arguing for the validity of the nation, he also emphasizes the value and importance of each individual. I brought you an excerpt from a poem of his, El Chiki Shofar, which literally is to my mouth a shofar. Checher is the palate, the gums, whatever. He means I raise up a shofar to my mouth. And look at this piece. This is my own rendering into English. He says, talking about, in the greater context within this poem, he's talking about how different people will pursue different things. There are those who will pursue scholarship. There are those who will pursue building. Everyone has their own thing. So he says, we will not measure every acquisition by our personal measure. We will know that each individual is only a unit, one portion, a share of our community. And how could the whole judge but little? Each person toward his heart's desire will travel and succeed, and from the fruit of their hands their nation will be elevated. Each in his trade will breathe the breath of life. When he builds for himself a home, the ruin of our people will be rebuilt. Everybody does their thing. And that is what contributes to the welfare of the nation as a whole. It's a direct line from what he had already learned from his mentor, Rabbi Berlin. I brought you another piece to this as well, in source number 15. Olat Raya is a collection of comments of Rabbi Kook, which relate to the Sidur. So that's the context in which this is brought, although it's not the context in which he originally said it. If you marvel at your ability to speak, listen, smell, sense, see, comprehend, and feel, then take this to heart. All who live now, and all who preceded you in their great numbers, influenced your entire existence. Not a single small entity is superfluous. All are needed, all serve a purpose. You do the same for all who are beneath you, and you are bound to all who ascend above you. Each individual has an impact, and at the same time is part of this chain. He's a very big believer in creativity. I brought you a quote from his introduction to Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs. Literature, painting, and sculpture aim to bring to realization all the spiritual concepts impressed deep in the human soul. He's giving religious value to human creativity. I love number 17. He talks about the idea of the divine light created on the first day of creation. Classic problem. When is the sun created in the 6 days of creation? Right, Yom Revi'i, day 4. But in the first day it says that God created light. So what's going on? So, without going into, again, full discussions about the days of creation, the classic idea expressed in the Midrash is that there's a pure light that God creates in the beginning, and then he hides it away because it's not something that everybody should use, and he creates this lower level of light that we see by. So Rabbi Kook, in source number 17, says regarding Rembrandt, he says, from time to time there are great men whom God blesses with a vision of that hidden light. I believe that Rembrandt was one of them, and the light in his paintings is that light which God created. It's a remarkable statement. He is open to having non-Jews in the land of Israel as well. He is not saying that there's no place for them. That's the Ger Toshav category he invokes in source number 18. And he has an impact on the students after him. The school of Rav Kook includes those later. And I brought you Rav Nachum Rabinovich in source number 19. I'm quoting myself there from a column from my Beit Midrash, as puts out a weekly publication called Toronto Torah with various articles. So this is an article I wrote on religious coercion last year, in which I quoted Rabbi Rabinovich, because I didn't have time to go back to Rabbi Rabinovich's material and just pull out the direct quote. But the point that I bring here is that Rabbi Rabinovich, who is a rabbi and an authority in Israel today, he is Kanai Nahara in his 80s, very much follows the teachings of Rav Kook, and he makes the argument for a state of Israel in which halacha is authoritative but not coercive. That's what he promotes, and there's more to be said about this at some point in time. At the same time as I say all of this, don't make the mistake of reading Rav Kook as your kindly uncle. In the same way that I said regarding Rav Eliyahu, don't assume that because he is fiery, that means he is strict. He is often lenient. At the same time, just because Rav Kook loves everybody and wants to support everybody and recognize the value of what they're doing as individuals and all of that, don't make the mistake of thinking that he's going to agree with you on everything. Yes, he was lenient regarding what's called the Heter Mechira. Heter Mechira, again, every 7 years we're supposed to leave the land in Israel fallow. These days it is a rabbinic rule as opposed to biblical in temple times. Reasons beyond the scope of this discussion. The problem is that leaving the land fallow means all these agricultural communities, especially end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, where they're not the startup nation in any way, shape, or form. Like, this is your entire economy, and this is your source of food. Where will you get food, and how are you going to survive? So an idea is promoted which has old roots, but it's never been nationally observed, not till that era, is called Heter Mechira. And basically the idea of Heter Mechira is you sell your ownership of the land to non-Jews for a couple of years. That doesn't permit every act of working on the land. Not everything can be done as a result, but it permits enough that now you'll be able to survive. There'll be someone growing food, you'll have a source of income, and Rabbi Kook supports the Heter Mechira. He says, I think this is necessary, and that's what I brought you in source number 20. If the stress is truly great to the point where the destruction of the communities and the balance, God forbid, it appears appropriate to permit. At the end of the day, he says, Shemitah, the sabbatical year is rabbinic today, and that's a factor in it. But you should know that what permits Rabbi Kook to be lenient on this is the fact that he is extremely strict on many of the laws of Shemitah. Meaning, in terms of how it's meant to be observed. If you're not selling the land, there are all sorts of debates about its implementation. Which types of acts are permitted, which ones are prohibited. And Rabbi Kook is very strict regarding the laws of Shemitah. That's what allows him to be lenient on this. It's not a simple matter of saying, well, he said, well, we can't worry about Shemitah today. I mentioned before, he is pro-democracy. He accepts the idea of a government that the nation accepts. When it came to women's suffrage, though, he believed 1 vote per household. He says, go back to the biblical text. He says, there you go. You know you're you're in the minority on this election here. He says biblically, the unit is identified as a family, a beit av. That's what it is. It's a family. And therefore, he says, the husband and wife should consult together, and then the wife should tell the husband who to vote for, and then he says the family votes as a unit. My point is not to discuss women's suffrage right now. That ship has sailed. They had this debate nearly 100 years ago. And he lost. And he lost back then. It didn't take long in the Jewish community then to recognize everybody's voting privileges. But
was he gracious loser?
Yes. When it comes to conversion, right, and the crises of today of whose conversions are recognized are not new. Rabbi Kook argued that if you convert somebody who does not intend to practice Judaism, he says you're guilty of what's called in Hebrew lifnei iver. You're putting a stumbling block in front of the blind. Because either their conversion is valid, in which case now they are Jews, but they're not observing, and you've created a situation in which they're called Jews, but they're not practicing, or their conversion is not recognized, but they think that they are Jewish, and they're going to marry a Jew, and you're causing stumbling in that regard. He was not a fan of that type of conversion. And as chief rabbi, he made attempts to change certain things to support religion. I translated a poster for you in source number 22. This poster was an eye-opener for me. I had never seen it until I was preparing this class. I realize we have like 3 minutes left. If anyone has to leave, I apologize and understand. I'm going to send out the link to the audio recording later. We may need a couple extra minutes. This is a poster that was promoted in the 1920s in Haredi Jewish communities. I don't know who was behind the poster. I don't know which organization promoted it. However, it mentions chiefly, so to speak, the chief rabbinate on it. And it's trying to encourage Haredim to get involved with the Jewish agency, with the Jewish community, and not to be in their own enclave. Now, you might listen to that and say, well, that's great. Everybody should be involved. They should be on board. But listen to the sales pitch. In a long back and forth with the designees of Knesset Yisrael, this larger Jewish community, we have acted, thank God, to introduce important improvements in religious matters in the laws of the Knesset Yisrael. Now that the leadership of the National Committee has accepted upon themselves to support the Rabbinate's efforts to prevent public desecration of religion, and certainly not to provide financial support for institutions involving desecration of religion, and that the elections for committees and municipalities which have a strong Haredi presence will only be with God-fearing men, and further important details, there is a sacred obligation on all who tremble at the word of God to join with the Jewish agency to be a legion defending all matters of the sanctity of Israel. In other words, the sales pitch is join in order to promote the ideals of the Haredi community, and that's what the rabbinate will work with you on. So I bring this. Yes, nothing changes.
Not the army.
Rav Kook actually supported Jewish defense and not drafting. There was no army. There was no IDF. He's too early. But he got himself into a lot of controversy. It's an interesting point. I'll take a second on it. In his Orot, he writes about the value of everything the secular pioneers do, and he mentions something that's called in Hebrew hitamlut. Now, today, what does hitamlut mean? Exercise. However, it was generally understood that was a code word. It was a code word for exercises of those who were training to fight the British. And that he was promoting their efforts in those early years. He got into a lot of trouble for it by those who did not, in fact, support that kind of activity. But Rav Kook would not have been anti, and in fact his students were very pro-military service. My point in bringing this source in number 22, though, is to try to explain, you can't convert somebody who is as complex as this into a one-dimensional figure of, we're going to put on Rabbi Kook everything we like. And just say that's who he was. He's my chief rabbi. It doesn't work that way. Yes, he was tolerant. Yes, he was respectful. Yes, he promoted the idea that every individual matters, and he respected the work of the secular pioneers. But don't kid yourself in terms of where he stood in terms of Jewish law and what he was trying to accomplish, which was ushering in a period of the Messiah in which Jews are going to return to the traditional practice of Judaism as he promotes it. In particular, there were two controversies I want to highlight in conclusion. Number one is, I brought you here in source number 23 from a writer, Ian Lustig, the issue of violence. The extraordinary range of interpretation among those seeking the authentic teaching of the Kooks, meaning Rabbi Kook himself and his son Rabbi Tzvi Yehuda Kook, who took over where he left off, is also exemplified in the contrasting views of Elazar Waldman and Yisrael Yaakov Yuval regarding Abraham Isaac Kook's attitude toward war and its relationship to the redemptive process. On the one hand, comments Waldman, war is accompanied by destruction and death. On the other hand, it increases the power of the Messiah. Unfortunately, it is still impossible to achieve the completion of redemption by any means other than war. In other words, the position of Rav Waldman, a Rosh Yeshiva in Hebron, and a student of the approach of Rabbi Kook Sr. and his son, Rabbi Tzvi Yehuda Kook, his argument is, war is sanctified as it brings about the redemption, and that's one take, which you can legitimately see in Rav Kook's writing. Rav Kook writes very romantically about what is accomplished via war. And then on the other hand, still in source 23, in sharp contrast to this view that Rabbi Kook sanctioned war as necessary to Israel's efforts to advance the redemption process, Yuval learns from Orot about, quote, the dangers inherent in extremist nationalism. You can legitimately see both in Rabbi Kook's writing. On the one hand, he talks about World War I as potentially leading to the purification of the world. And then on the other hand, he writes about how the Jews stopped running their own country at a time when it required a barbaric character to run a country, and we were only meant to return in a time of greater civilization. Again, he didn't live to see what would happen. But he is for and against. You can see that in his writing, and his students have gone in different directions in the way they learn from him. That's one controversy. The other one is the one I alluded to in much earlier on, when I talked about his attitude to the secular pioneers. He believed that what they were doing was a necessary step for bringing the Messiah. But he used an idea which is found in mysticism, which turned a lot of people off. And that idea is called Chamoro Shel Mashiach, the donkey of Mashiach. You may be familiar with the prophecy found in Tanakh that Mashiach is going to arrive, Ani, a pauper, Rochev ala Chamor, riding on a donkey. And the idea is, Chamor, donkey, is from the same root as the word Chomer. Chomer means material substance. Materialism is Chomriut. So the idea is that those who are working to build up the physical, material land of Israel, its economy, its farming, and so on, are the Chamor of Mashiach. They're the donkey that brings in the Messiah. Well, some people look at that as very flattering. He sees us as critical for the arrival of the Messiah. Other people look at that as an insult. And they say, what do you mean? We are not the unwitting means towards bringing about your messianic redemption. We aren't interested in your messianic redemption. We are interested in doing what we believe is valuable. Don't hang your ideas on us. And especially to say that we are the unwitting ones is taken by some as patronizing and insulting. Take a look at source number 24. This is from Rabbi Kook's Hesped, his eulogy for Theodor Herzl. That's its own saga, the story of the eulogy for Herzl. But he writes in this eulogy, complete perfection is when the body, this is my translation, the original is Hebrew. Complete perfection is when the body is appropriately strong and developed, and the soul is healthy and strong and developed. So God prepared in Israel especially these two forces. The force that is parallel to the value of the human form, desiring the good of the nation in its material position and development, which is the proper foundation for all of the great and holy programs in which Israel excels, to be a holy nation for Hashem, God of Israel. He liked run-on sentences. And to be one nation in the land, a light for the nations. And a second side, the force that develops the spirituality itself. He saw value in both, but not everybody liked being co-opted. And so, to this day, you find hostility towards this school and those who carry it on, who feel like it's inappropriate to do what he did. From his perspective, what he's doing is positive. And from his followers' perspective, they believe that they're seeing the light within a group that is fundamentally anti, not just separate from, but anti their religious values, and saying, look, we're seeing value in what they do. That's a good thing. But for others, this wasn't desired. They were not open and happy about it. So there's some controversy in his legacy in that regard as well. As always, there is much, much more to say. Once again, I will note, Jewish Bioethics, our next series begins, I believe, November 14th, so in 2 weeks' time. Registration is now available online. I expect to send out the flyer with the link later on when I send out the follow-up email from this class. Thank you very much.
Thank you.